Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all into coming to tonight's lecture. My name is Dr. Mark Herzog, and I'm the acting director of the British Institute at Ankara. Tonight's lecture, Understanding Problems of Gender-Based Violence in Humanitarian Crises, Interventions with Syrian Refugees, was organized by the British Institute at Ankara, the Turkish-American Association, and NIHA. I'd like to do a little spiel for the BIA by saying that we have a few brochures available on that side if anybody would like to find out more about ourselves, and I'm also free for any inquiries. I'd like to give a few introductory words now, and then I'll pass on to tonight's amazing speaker. And after the talk, we'll have around 20 to 30 minutes question time, and maybe more if people would like to take it further. Dr. Leyla Welkin was born in Gaziantep, but she spent most of her life in the US. This includes her training as well as her 25 years of professional experience. She's focused for most of her career on gender violence, family therapy, cross-cultural learning and education, and has had extensive experience of working in medical and professional and academic settings. She returned in 2008 to Turkey, where she undertook research training and work with a variety of non-governmental organizations, governmental organizations, and universities, focusing primarily on issues of gender-based violence. At the moment, she's working for the UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, and which on projects that are serving Syrians in Turkey and building capacity for working on issues with sexual violence and gender-based violence. From a personal point, I have to say that I first met Leyla in 2009 on the tops of the Ankara Kale. And what has always impressed me is the commitment, the energy, and the passion that she brings to her work. So I'm very pleased that she has agreed to give this talk tonight, and I'm very honored to being able to introduce her. So, Dr. Welkin, the floor is yours.
It's very kind of you, Mark. Thank you. I'm not used to using microphones. I'm also not used to sitting down while I talk, but we'll do our best here. It's lovely to see all of you come out on such a cold and messy night. I'm impressed that we'd actually have a good turnout when it's so windy and rainy. So thanks for coming. The way I've been thinking about this is that I'd like to give about a half an hour of general, much more conceptual kinds of thoughts. I want to talk with you about gender-based violence with a broad brush at first, and try and orient our thinking towards it in gender-based violence in humanitarian settings and in the situation of war in particular, because I think it might be helpful to have an orientation. And then if you want to talk about more specifics and particular issues, we can get into that in a more question, answer, and discussion format. So that was kind of how I was thinking about how to structure this. So if you're game, I'd like to just launch in and share a little information with you. So, one of the things that's interesting for me, as Mark pointed out, you might not have done the math, but I'm not a super young person. I've been doing this work for a little while. And on one hand, it's delightful, after having worked on issues of gender-based violence for about 30 years now, that suddenly, within the last couple of years, gender-based violence is flavor of the month. I mean, everybody's talking about gender-based violence, you know. We're talking about rape, we're talking about the abuse of children, suddenly we're talking about the abuse of boys, we're talking about violence and, you know, harassment, severe harassment of gay and lesbian and trans people in a way that, let's be honest, we weren't talking about these topics just, you know, 10, 20, 30 years ago when I went into this field. This was not a topic of polite conversation. We didn't talk about this stuff, certainly not in the newspaper. Certainly there weren't these high-level government discussions of these issues, or if they were horribly misinformed and mostly really damaging. So on one level, it's very exciting to see a topic that I'm very committed to seeing change in getting talked about so much. Breaking the silence is something that we've been talking about in this field, and how important and how key it is to break the silence about gender-based violence. So on one hand, I'm delighted. On the other hand, though, I feel kind of cautious about it, because one of the problems, as we're all aware, when a topic becomes popularized is that it also tends to get really simplified, and we begin to simplify the topic down into media handy sound bites and slogans, and we become dazzled by the most sensational aspects, and, you know, basically the topic in some ways unfortunately tends to get dumbed down. And the trouble with that when it comes to GBV is that we really need to be careful about the difference between reality and the media package. GBV goes much deeper than the specific crimes that we might hear about, than the particular violations of individual human rights that tend to capture headlines. Those are not the things that affect the largest number of people who are dealing with gender-based violence. Because when it comes right down to it, gender-based violence exists everywhere where there are systematic differences between power and access, between males and females and people of different gender and sexual orientations. That's a large category of things because it's basically everywhere. So we've got a problem here, because what captures headlines and what gets people excited or interesting is specific crimes. You know, that gory picture on the front page of the, you know, woman with the knife through her heart, or the flashy thing about how many women have been raped in the Congo. I'm not saying these things are unimportant. Please don't misunderstand me. I don't want to trivialize these horrible events. They're really significant and important. But the trouble is that they grab our attention and pull it away from the fact that the main thing we need to pay attention to when we're talking about gender-based violence is structural issues. Structural violence that's built into culture and built into the social structures, fabric all around us. So power imbalance, the things that shape the life options of girls, women, boys, men, anybody with a different sexual or gender orientation are the things that we need to have our attention available for. So let me, when I first started working in this particular area with the Syrian thing, I got into trouble right away. It's one of my things. I get into trouble rather quickly sometimes. And the way I got into trouble was by saying too much to a reporter. And it's really easy to do, I found out, because you don't have to say very much at all, and it becomes something you never thought you said. But in any case, I realized at that time that what was capturing people's attention was this notion of rape and pillage as part of war. And it's true, there is rape and pillage as part of war. But I'd like to have us turn our attention to some of the other issues that are also going on and that are also very significantly affected by a humanitarian disaster like a war. For instance, I'm concerned about one of the things we see a lot with Syrians in Turkey is marriage of Syrian girls between the ages of 13 and 17. That's really young to be married. But it's also really common. Now, it was really common in Syria before the war. It was also not so uncommon on this side of the border. And so, in fact, while it's not legal in either Syria or in Turkey, either side of the border, marriage of girls between the ages of 13 and 17 has not been uncommon for a long time, for a very, very long time. The trouble is that what happens in a circumstance like the humanitarian disaster of war is economic problems mount up on families, and also people are afraid. They're experiencing a collapse of security. They're experiencing a situation where they can't count on security, and their lives have become much more tentative and dangerous. So, parents, as I think any of us who are parents will appreciate, want to protect their children. And one of the things that a Syrian family sometimes thinks is protective of their girl between 13 and 17 is to marry her to someone who will thereby protect her, and bonus, that family is also then potentially relieved of the economic burden of caring for that girl, and maybe they even have created an alliance with another family that might assist them economically as well. So you can appreciate that you have to think about this a little bit differently to understand why something like child marriage might increase a lot under circumstances of a humanitarian disaster. But in fact it does, and talking with Syrians in Turkey, it's pretty clear that this has increased significantly. So one of the reasons that I think we need, the other thing that happens when we talk with Syrians in the camps, because I'm talking with folks in camps a lot, is they're not necessarily even aware that this is illegal. To them, it's so customary, it doesn't seem necessarily problematic. It's ordinary. So, and the other question that comes up is, does the law of Turkey apply here, or does the law of Syria apply here? It's not actually legal in Syria either, but part of what that illustrates for you is the degree to which people aren't particularly focused on law. Law is not really what has ruled this kind of social custom in people's lives. The thing that seems to have been the authority that's more important, continues to be the authority that's more important to many people, is the authority of people who are termed sheikhs. People who have a tribal authority, who have fundamentally a religious authority. And the reason that those people and their authority is so important is because they're so much closer and more intimate to the facts of people's lives. Government, rules from on high, police, courts, those kinds of things, they're not right here, they're not right now, they're not what affects our daily life so much in this kind of a cultural setting. So I'm trying to sketch out for you why something like the early marriage of a girl not only is natural and comfortable for people, but why they're shocked when you might say, this is a violation, this is problematic for your daughter, this causes real trouble. Because that's not where people are coming from, and they have all kinds of reasons for believing that it's a good thing. Okay? So what's going on though is we've got communities who are in a humanitarian disaster. A community is struggling to maintain some sense of social order. Because that's the definition of a humanitarian disaster, isn't it? The breakdown of customary social order. Material order as well. But material order is the thing that captures our attention quickest. In fact, the social structures tend to be broken or at least badly damaged under those same circumstances. And so people are trying very hard to grab a hold of anything that gives them a sense of security or a sense of order that makes sense to them. And appeals back to tradition can make a lot of sense. So in fact, people who are asserting the importance or the value of child marriage, for instance, are often saying, look, this is morally right because it's protection of our traditional social order. And we're in a situation of social breakdown and chaos. So I think it's very important to be aware that that's the kind of motivation that makes people hold on hard. So we're talking about traditional patriarchal families, where that's a structure that people have followed for so long, people don't have any concept of any other possibility. Men's role in a traditional patriarchal family, I just repeat it for you again, even though you already know it well, is to protect, is to provide, and is to create the kind of order for their family that makes that family a viable social unit in the society, right? The role of men is very central in a traditional patriarchal family. The tricky part is that in situations of war, men are very distracted. There's something else that's got their attention. So we've got a situation where we've got to look at what the role of men is going to be in a family. If it's not going to be a traditional role, what can it be? And I would submit to you that one of the reasons people hold on so hard to their traditions under these kinds of disastrous conditions is that they're not sure what else could emerge. And they sure as heck don't just want chaos. And I think we can all empathize with that. So, if we stop and think about what's happened in the questioning of inequality that is part of the gender-based violence issue, is we notice that there is sometimes a missing piece in developing a strong vision of what else we're going to look for. If we don't want a patriarchal, traditional family style, what do we want? What's it going to look like? What are these after the patriarchy families going to be? If we've got equality between men and women, if we've got different gender and sexual orientations able to make families, what do those families look like? And what's the social fabric that builds up around them? That's a conversation that I think it's really important to have, because if we don't have it, then the floor goes to those people who say, you're just talking about the breakdown of society and you're not helping us to take care of our families. So I think a legitimate point. So let's look at the issue of humanitarian disaster, because on some level there's a lot that's really obvious and there's some things that may not be quite so obvious about it. Obviously, in humanitarian crises and disasters, we've got both natural disasters and man-made disasters. Natural disasters are acts of God, weather-related things, the typhoon that we're having now in the Philippines, the earthquakes, the tidal waves, all those kinds of natural disasters. On one level, they're acts of God, people say, and it's often a little bit difficult to identify who you're going to blame. I know we're talking a lot about climate change these days. I think that's part of the effort to have somebody to hold responsible for things that are basically out of everybody's control, which doesn't mean I'm questioning climate change. But humans have this habit of blaming. But in any case, it's tougher. It's tougher to locate who to blame in a situation of natural disaster. Of course, we tend to blame the relief effort. We tend to blame the people who are in government who should have done a better job, and so on and so forth. But in fact, responsibility is harder, and therefore also acceptance of the conditions can be a little bit easier. But under the conditions of human-made disasters, wars, persecutions, genocides, all these kinds of activities, one of the key things that we've got is lots of blame to go around. Innocence is tough to come by. And one of the other key things that I think we need to pay more attention to is how much broken trust there is between people. Broken trust, broken relationships. Working with Syrians in camps right now, one of the things that's really striking is how much broken interpersonal trust there is between people. And I'm talking between Syrians and Syrians, between Turks and Syrians, and between Syrians and Turks. Everybody. Because, in fact, broken trust is at the core of what happens in a war. If you think about it, in a situation like the Syrian war, most of these folks were living in their ordinary neighborhood, in their regular life, doing whatever it was they did, and then suddenly their neighborhood, their particular area, came under bombardment or was attacked, or some of their neighbors might even have risen up and come after them. Suddenly, an orderly, normal life breaks down all around you. It's really a pretty devastating experience of loss. I also think it's a pretty difficult thing to empathize with if you haven't experienced it. I haven't experienced it. I haven't lived in the conditions of war, but living in this, living with people who are so affected by this, I begin to get a clue about just how devastating it is. And one of the things that people say again and again is how immense their losses are and how much they're affected by the uncertainty, the pain of the uncertainty of what's going to happen next in their lives, who they can trust, when they might be able to go back, when will this thing be over, what's going to happen to my education, are my children going to be able to get any education, are we going to have enough to eat here? What about clothes for this winter? I mean, the level of uncertainty in people's lives, I'm speaking as a psychologist here, is really incredibly potent. So I think one of the key questions that people are struggling with is this disrupted fabric of human relationships, which is a key in disasters. And one of the things that we forget sometimes when we just distribute goods is how important it is to repair people's ability to trust one another. Without trust, I don't care how many clothes you give away, I don't care if you set up a whole bunch of tents and distribute food, you've still got people sitting in their dark and cold and miserable corners being afraid and not knowing what to do with that fear. So material aid is not enough. We have to figure out how to recreate social fabric and help people to restore a sense of social order and solidarity. Solidarity is one of the big casualties of a humanitarian disaster like war. And I don't think I have to go into any detail, but just remind you of the situation that we've still got going on in Iraq for a nice example of a long, long run at this kind of a damaged social fabric situation. So, in a case, in that sense then, the programs that I work with to intervene in gender-based violence, our core focus is on helping people to rebuild their ability to trust and have interpersonally solid relationships. So, I want to move to the next slide here. Okay. So here's a sort of an interesting thing. We've got this civil war, Syrian civil war. It's just chaotic. It's gone international. Whoever the first original parties were to this mess, it's not them that are necessarily the motivating force behind the violence anymore. It's gotten so complicated with state and non-state actors. People outside the borders are probably just as important as people inside the borders now. And I mean, I'm not going to mince words. It's a terrible mess. It's a destructive orgy. And of course, everybody is jockeying for opportunities for power and influence. I mean, that's the key thing going on. And I think we could be forgiven, any of us, for feeling that this is further evidence of what a lot of us tend to think anyway, which is, you know, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Violence is just over the top. We, you know, all of us are greeted in the news, newspapers, televisions, whatever, with how horrible violence is in the world today. So it's quite counterintuitive, but it is in fact factual that the violence levels in the world overall have probably actually reduced, and reduced substantially over the last few hundred years. Steven Pinker is a Canadian experimental and cognitive psychologist who happens to be working now at Harvard. And he published a book in 2011 called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I really recommend to you if you're interested in the topic of violence. It's an 800-page tome. I'm not going to be able to do justice to his argument here, but it is rich with statistics and history and experimental evidence. So, I mean, this man is a scholar, he's done his homework, and he makes a very convincing case that indeed violence the world over has substantially dropped over the last several hundred years. And the components that he names that are the basis of that then are relatively enlightened and in any case, state power, the state monopoly on violence is one thing he names, but also then relatively enlightened democratic states are important. A globalized economy and trade is another factor that he shows having been important. Improved communications, literacy, media, and a significant increase in people's awareness of other people's realities around the world. He puts forward a very interesting piece of an argument, which is about how important the invention of the novel was, because for the first time people were reading first-person accounts of experiences that they could have never known anything about, but that in fact it was an empathy-building experience for lots of people, and there's some correlation between the increase in literacy, the development of novels and first-person narratives, and decreases in the murder rate in the places where that was happening. So it's a very interesting argument. He also shows that there's been a significant increase in valuing human rights, generally. Human rights, animal rights, even environmental things, though he's not particularly interested in environmental issues himself. And then the final piece of his argument is he also shows that there have been measurable increases in the ability to use reasonable thinking and abstract thinking. I mean, he shows through psychological experimental evidence that indeed people think now at a much more abstract level, generally speaking, than they did just 50 or 100 years ago. And in fact, also our reason and since the Enlightenment in Europe, the appeal to reason and the use of reason as an important factor in decision making has substantially increased. And he makes an argument that this has a lot to do with the reduction in violence historically in the world. So, I mean, he's careful to say that the reduction in violence is neither inevitable nor irreversible. He's simply talking about a trend. He's not saying this will go on, nor is he saying it had to be. But one of the things he says, and I think this is so interesting, is that the reduction is almost universally unobserved. The quote I want to read from him is, "The decline of violence may be the most significant and least appreciated development in the history of our species," which is a pretty interesting thing to think about. He talks a bit about why we might not be willing or able to notice this reduction in violence, why we might resist the idea that humans have stopped being as violent as they used to be. And I mean, I really invite you to look at it. I think when we look at a war as close up as we're looking at the Syrian civil war, it is really tough to believe this. But at the same time, if we can believe that there's a piece of this, one of the things that maybe it can help us to see is that violence is a super risky way to initiate change. There's a very high cost for change that comes with violence. But the thing is, change is something that a lot of us are looking for. To a large extent, a lot of us have a desire for certain kinds of change. And he actually, one of the pieces of his argument, he pulls out, you've probably heard of before, it's a psychological thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma. And it involves a choice where two prisoners are essentially given the choice to either cooperate with each other or betray one another. And depending upon, it's a sort of, there's a mathematical matrix for if they decide to cooperate or if they decide to betray, or if one betrays and the other cooperates, how that works out in terms of benefit and cost to the two of them. So it's, mathematically clear. He transposes this prisoner's dilemma into the pacifist dilemma. And he says basically, the person who's choosing not to be violent has a challenge on their hands, because if you choose essentially to surrender and the other party chooses to attack, the cost to you is potentially very, very high. If, on the other hand, you both choose to betray each other, the cost is extraordinarily high to both, even if one person is a victor, or one country or group is the victor, they still pay a very high cost for that victory. The cooperative choice, where both decide to cooperate, provides, potential benefits to both parties that are far greater than what either could win through a contest that was, one betraying and one cooperating. But of course, this is something that has to be part of a rational calculus. There is a choice that has to be made to come to this. And there's a negotiation process that one can come through or go through in order to arrive at the decision about whether to cooperate or to betray, whether to initiate violence or to attempt negotiation. And I think, one of the things that's so problematic, as I watch anyway, what's going on right now in this Syrian situation, is the people who are paying the highest cost do not appear to be the people who are making the decisions about what is going to be going on in terms of that decision. The choices are being made separate from a lot of the cost. Not entirely, but I think this is highly problematic because it shifts the calculus. But nonetheless, moving back into the notion that there is a possibility for rational choice about violence, and once we get the picture that the cost can be very high, perhaps we can make some different and more rational choices about it. So now I want to move back to gender-based violence specifically, because that's violence much more generally. Though we have actually reduced gender-based violence in certain parts of the world substantially as well. I mean, just for your information, in the United States, which is the place where some of the best statistics are available. This is also true in the UK, another place where they've kept good statistics. Over the last, over the 5 years from the late 90s to about 2005, which is the last time that we have really good statistics for, both domestic violence and sexual violence were reduced by over 60% in both the United States and actually I don't know about sexual violence in the UK. Domestic violence in the UK is 61% is the figure they give, and in the US it's closer to 62-ish, but basically 60%. That's a huge reduction, It's not zero. I'd love to see zero, but just for your information, we do know a few things that actually really do help. We really have been able to make a difference. So that's in general gender-based violence, okay? And so, because I'm a veteran and I can give you a little bit of a perspective from a while ago, I want to say that when I first entered this field in the 1980s in the United States as a young and very enthusiastic therapist, the thing that we were focused on was rape. Rape in the 1980s was sort of the feminist cause. And of course, what we were really angry about at that time was the degree to which the victims of rape, mostly women and children, were being blamed for the rapes, and the perpetrators themselves were, for the most part, waltzing away, scot-free or with extraordinarily small amount of punishment. You remember the phrases. I don't even probably have to hardly remind you. What were you wearing that for? What's a nice girl doing in a neighborhood like that at that time of night? What did you expect wearing a mini skirt like that? I don't have to give you all the quotes. She's a 13-year-old who behaves in such an adult manner. Of course she knows what she's doing. These are things that we said in the United States 30 years ago. They sound pretty familiar when we hear them in the press today in Turkey too. So the world over, a lot of things don't change very much. But what was going on at that time in the United States was an over-focus for a while on blaming the victim. But the interesting thing that happened then was we switched over from blaming the victim to just helping the victims. I'm not against helping victims. I really think it's a great thing that we developed shelter houses, women's counseling centers. I think it's a really good thing that we now have rape crisis networks. I think having camps and refugee shelter situations for people fleeing this war, having places, the violence monitoring and prevention centers that we've got here in Turkey now. These are excellent things. Don't get me wrong. I'm not critiquing that we have these services. It's excellent to help people who are suffering. At the same time, if we only help people who are suffering and we do not hold responsible the perpetrators or the people who are creating this suffering, who are exercising the violence, we are not going to accomplish our goal, which is to reduce the violence. So service to victims, the other danger of it is that it can too easily ignore the structural problem that actually has both the victim and the perpetrator trapped inside it. Because I would submit to you that there is no such thing as someone who's a pure perpetrator of gender-based violence. We're all victims of it. Because I don't think that being abusive is actually an advantage to anyone. Abusive power, even if you're exercising abusive power, there's research there too, actually, that shows that people who exercise power abusively also experience harm. So instead of trying to say, you know, these are the bad people and these are the good people and we'll help the good people and shame on the bad people, I think one of the trickiest parts is for us all to recognize that unfortunately the perpetrators of gender-based violence are us. Ordinary people are the people who commit violent acts for the most part. Most of the people, and I've done work with perpetrators before, the statistics, again, I'm not giving you a lot of statistics because, to be frank with you, I don't like a lot of the statistics in this field. It's not a great field to get good statistics because we have a hard time getting agreement on definitions, and we have a hard time getting agreement on our methodology for gathering those statistics, so the statistics we get are notoriously soft. But here's a statistic for you. They say that of the perpetrators of domestic and sexual violence in the United States, and I'm talking now primarily about people who've been convicted of crimes, because those are the primary people that we have available to us to do the research on, so we know that's actually a small slice. But it's actually an important slice, because these are people doing things that are pretty severe that people have actually heard about and have gone through a process. Okay, we find that about 80% of those people are normal, everyday people. 20% or less, it's actually often closer to 6%. So 20 to 6 is a big range, but in any case, I'm more on the 6% side, who knows. But in any case, we're talking a very small percentage of these people who actually have any serious mental health problem. Okay? So most of us have this idea that the people who perpetrate domestic violence and sexual violence are sick individuals or perverts or messed up people. And in fact, they're not. They're pretty ordinary people for the most part, unfortunately. However, they do have one very important characteristic in common. They have very distorted perceptions of how socially normal their behavior is. Most perpetrators of sexual and domestic violence believe that the violent behavior that they're exercising is normal. They are out of step with their peers. They're wrong about what most of the people around them are doing, but they actually think that they're doing things that are very average. Okay? So that's the big thing we can identify about them, that their social perception is off. So on one level, their social perception is really off, but I would submit to you that on another level, their social perception is kind of accurate because they're in touch with the structural violence that undergirds their decision that violence makes sense and is in their interests at any given moment. And I think we can look at that on the micro level in domestic violence and sexual violence and, families and communities, and we could look at that on the macro level in war. Because when was the last time you heard it is in our interests to do this act of political or military, whatever it is? I mean, it is in our interests is a phrase we're hearing again and again. People make what they consider to be rational decisions to use violence, because that's the calculus. So I would submit that the people who are perceiving themselves as having a pass or thinking that violence is ordinary or natural are on one level actually quite in touch. So I want to give you another example of a kind of gender-based violence that we see a lot in a humanitarian situation, and that I think fits in with this example. Because one of the things that we see a lot of in the Syrian-Turkish situation is women who are very dependent upon men. A woman who is brought up in a traditional setting, and many of the people that we're working with who have fled to Turkey from Syria are women who've grown up either in rural areas or for one reason or another have been raised where the primary skills they have are to be mothers, housekeepers. They may or may not, most of them do not have very much education. And so their primary skills are the protection, nurturing, care, and feeding of children and a family. I have nothing against these skills. I love those skills. I'm a mother myself, and I highly value them. It's wonderful that people know how to do those things, and we need lots of it in the world. And women who have no other skills are at a tremendous disadvantage when the social fabric around them breaks down, because they depend upon men to provide for their material needs and to support them with protection. And those things disappear under a humanitarian disaster. So women who are unaccompanied by male relatives under these circumstances are at a tremendous disadvantage. It's dangerous for them. And so some of the women who come to us first in these camp situations, or when we're talking with Syrians, are the women who don't have men, don't have male relatives to care for them or protect them, because they are tremendously vulnerable. One of the things that in particular they don't have is a marketable skill that they will be paid money for doing. So they can't easily provide for their own livelihood. And when the primary thing they know how to do is be a wife, one of the things that they feel is a resource to them is their capacity to be sexual objects. And of course, there are people who are happy to utilize them in that way. So transactional or survival sex, or often in this situation too, being one of multiple wives, a second, a third, or a subsequent wife, can feel like an appropriate or necessary choice to a woman who doesn't have any other means of caring for herself or finding protection. So when women are limited and when you have an inflexible society, you've got the formula that creates the circumstances for things like transactional sex, survival sex, and women feeling like they have to become the second, third, or whatever wife of somebody. So, the unfortunate thing is that there are people both in the Turkish and in the Syrian community who are happy to take advantage of that situation. And then, of course, the other thing that's true is that for those women, once they've made that choice, that is essentially for them social suicide. Because once, well, I'm talking about the transactional or the survival sex, once you've moved into the not a good woman category, it's pretty hard to rehabilitate yourself from that situation. So this is a tragic, but some people perceive it as a necessary choice, or they are coerced into it in a variety of ways. You can see why coercion into something like that might not be so difficult if the desperation level got high enough. So people who become fair game then for predatory men and opportunistically cruel people are a characteristic of a humanitarian disaster made by humans. One of the other things we notice in the camp is incredible destructive gossip. A lot of conflict between inter-ethnic, inter-religious, political, and sexual factions, because again, going back to our broken trust and difficulty with building and having solid relationships. There's an enormous amount of anger and grief, sadness, that feeds right into social unrest and social persecution. This shouldn't be shocking to any of us if we just think about it. But one of the tricky parts is that protection from the outside, the fence around the outside of a refugee camp, the border that is well guarded along Turkish and Syrian border, it's not enough to have those perimeters, because in fact the problem goes right inside of our own hearts and spirits, inside of our own families. And when the perimeters and the protection have to happen right inside of us, it's a much trickier proposition. So rigid, angry, anxious, fearful people, of course, are more violent. And finding ways to protect about that is a much more psychological and interpersonal process. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at a situation where we need an antidote. I mean, I don't want to just talk about the ugliness and the horror of it all, because I'm fundamentally an optimistic person. Wouldn't have been able to be in this field for as long as I have if I wasn't. And I believe really strongly that one of the things that we have in a disaster and around the edges of war are opportunities for change. Social change is happening anyway. It's going to be. There's going to be social changes, so let's see how we can make those changes as positive as possible. And of course, it's pretty clear that one of the key things that we can do to make those changes positive is to encourage as much full participation of everyone in the process as possible. Girls, women, men, boys, people of all orientations. We know from looking at the research around the world that when people, I've forgotten to keep switching my slides. We've forgotten that when people have the opportunity to participate in economic life and in decision making, those societies are far more prosperous. Maybe we haven't forgotten it, but we don't pay enough attention to it. So societies that allow and encourage full participation of everybody in both economic and decision making do better. We actually have the evidence to show this. So we can show that flexible, innovative, prosperous communities and societies are one of the results of a strong participative process. And so we've got the possibility to encourage that. And that's one of the things, for instance, that we're doing, for instance, in our GBV program. One of the things we're doing in one of the camps right now is helping to support the development of a women's committee, because the women wanted to participate more fully in the administration of their own lives, and having an opportunity to talk about what they need and talk with the people who are managing both the infrastructure but also their social life, so that their ideas matter in what happens day to day for them, has been a really powerful experience for many of them. Now, I'm not going to make any grand claims for it. It's still a teeny weeny little move, perhaps, in the right direction. But we're attempting to show that there is another possibility. So empowering women and youth is part of an inclusive process, which we hope will involve also some envisioning, some creation of new vision of what is this post-patriarchal, post-inequality society? What's that social fabric we hope to create? What's the solidarity that we want to have emerge from all this violent breakdown? I don't have the answers, but I bet if we all work on it together, we'll come up with some better ones. I am really convinced that we are all at the same time both wholes and parts of wholes. I don't think there's anything in the world that you can find that isn't at one and the same time whole in itself, any living thing, and at the same time a part of something else. And I think a lot of our confusion gets going when we forget that we're either a whole or a part, or we get really preoccupied with our wholeness or our partness. So I think it might be interesting for us to do a little more practicing of noticing the places and the times and the ways that we are a whole, as I am right now, speaking to you as an individual with some thoughts of our own, and how I'd really like to be part of a conversation with you, get more of your ideas in this pot too. So I'm just going to conclude with a phrase I remember from my childhood. The American National Negro College Fund had a slogan that I do like some slogans, and I really love this one. A mind is a terrible thing to waste. I think a life is a terrible thing to waste too. And maybe one of the things that we learn with GBV in humanitarian disasters is just how true that is. So please, will you join me? I've got other things, we can share more information, we can talk further about this, but if you've got questions, answers, or comments, I appreciate your interest in this topic. Let's have some more conversation. You had something you wanted to say.
Sorry, because of the applause, I put my hand down, clapped, and my mind's gone.
You lost it. Okay. If it's important, it'll come back.
Should we take 3 questions and then let you answer?
It's fine if you want to order. One by one is fine with me, in that they might build on each other.
Okay.
But it's fine with me.
Okay, so
it's whatever you prefer.
It came back.
Okay, it came back.
I was curious, you have the women that say they come from a very traditional background in Syria, they come to Turkey.
Yep.
And in the camps, they've gone through the turmoil of a political revolution. They come into the camps and they go through a cultural revolution, let's say.
Of sorts.
This is what I feel, turning from some kind of patriarchal system to a more pro-matriarchal system.
Well, wait a minute now. Don't, I'm talking my concepts. I'm not saying that's necessarily what's happening at all.
Anyway, okay, so we're trying to have a more productive space for the women to be part of.
That's the hope. I'm speaking hope here. I'm not necessarily speaking about what's definitely happening.
So my question is, I know it's early days and the people aren't necessarily returning back to Syria, but
right.
As these women and the men, I assume as well, and the families become more enlightened and seeing the benefits of having a more equal relationship with the men and women, what do you think the results will be when they go back into Syria? Do you think they will return to a more traditional patriarchal society that they left? Or do you think this will have a lasting effect on the people who stayed in Syria? Do you believe this improvement of their situation, is it just a camp-based improvement, or do you think it will be an improvement that can be replicated within Syria itself?
Aren't you dear for capturing so much of my hope? I feel I've overrepresented the hopeful side, perhaps, because indeed I'm not at all sure that this is a major part of anybody's experience. I'm talking about trying to put small pieces in place towards that kind of a vision, rather than believing that there is some major tide or big push in that direction. That said, I am aware that, for instance, the Turkish Disaster Ministry, who administers the camps, there's a lot of rhetoric and there's a lot of talk about the importance of making sure that girls too are part of the education that's offered in the camps. They do a lot of talking about how much they respect women and make sure that women get a chance to voice their concerns to camp management and so forth. I'd have to say I think it's quite camp specific, exactly what happens at any given place for any given family or group. So I cannot in any way, shape, or form represent some grand tide of positive change that I think is happening. I'm more speaking about what I'd like to see happen and what I think would be a solution towards gender-based violence, and I think we're making small steps in that direction, trying to build capacity in that direction. If indeed we were successful, of course one would hope that it would be deep enough and thoroughgoing enough to be transportable. But this is a lot of ifs, isn't it? And I was speaking more as an activist than a scholar in my hopeful energy. So I am an activist, but let's get cautious here.
Okay, so we have one question over there.
Thank you very much. Can you say a little bit more about the nature, not being explicit necessarily, but the nature of the gender-based violence, because I understood that women are very vulnerable in these situations. You talked about that, and you talked about the attempt to empower women. But I can understand that women who don't have their men with them, as you said, are in vulnerable positions. And you talked about predatory men. Are they generally ones that are committing violence toward women in this case, or how is that actually managed?
Well, I'm really trying to say that ordinary people commit gender-based violence as a matter of course just by living their ordinary lives when we have strong traditional patriarchal structure to our society, which equals most of the time in this situation. And I'm trying to direct our attention away from the discrete specific rapes and beatings and abuse incidents. All of those do exist. All of those happen. And for the same reasons that it's difficult to report specific incidents in, downtown Chicago, it's difficult to report specific incidents in a refugee camp or downtown Gaziantep, because people who report are often blamed, and people who go for help are often going to receive the punishment for being outside the lines of what we all think is good behavior. So I'm actually not, I'm not going to give you statistics because honestly the gathering of statistics is a problematic exercise in this field, especially under these circumstances. But is there gender-based violence? You bet. Is it always what meets the eye? Absolutely not. And does gender-based violence mostly go under the radar of what we're paying attention to? You bet.
So it's sort of exaggerated normal gender-based violence in this
Yep.
scenario.
Whatever people live in their ordinary lives, they do it even more under conditions of chaos. Stressed people, rigid people, people who are fearful are more violent. It's true the world over.
Do you consider transactional sex gender-based violence?
Because the woman is doing it out of a sense of necessity. If she's freely doing it, but then how could she be freely doing it if she's doing it just to survive, And I've worked with prostitutes, and I've worked with sexual violence is one of my special areas of focus. And I question the degree to which we can pull apart individual choice and social coercion when it comes to commercial sex work. So that's a big topic, but it's highly problematic. And I do consider it gender-based violence, yes, especially under these kinds of circumstances. In a humanitarian setting, especially.
We had a question over there.
I'm interested in hearing about your work specifically. What is your day like? What are you working on now? Could you tell us a little more?
I'm working on a few too many things. I spend half my week in Ankara and half my week down in mostly Nizip camp, which is near Gaziantep. So I spend half my week working with the agencies here, trying to coordinate with the Ministry of Social and Family Policy, the Disaster Ministry, and the UN agencies that are working on these issues, and making sure we have a coherent approach and that we're coordinating our efforts. And then I spend part of the week in the camp working with the Syrians and with the camp management, providing training and support for both individuals and the groups. So I'm a person who likes to be involved in the application. We're developing a pilot. The idea is that if we get a good notion of how to do this appropriately in this setting, we'll be able to disseminate that information to other people who want to do similar stuff, and they'll be more effective because it'll be somewhat tested. That's the theory.
We have a question here.
You told that for example, stressed people or people who has less self-confidence maybe are much more aligned to the violence.
More likely.
Yeah, more likely. But I guess it's much more related with the human nature itself, because in the end, human being is a selfish being, and it's one way. It may be female to male to female, male to male, female to female. It's one way of showing power actually. Because I'm powerful than you, and you should obey me. And when these crises, humanitarian crises appear, that selfishness actually becomes much more, goes much to the surface. And and for example, what you said in the beginning, the questions of what am I going to wear tomorrow, what am I going to eat tomorrow, that kind of questions becomes more apparent. And actually, that selfishness becomes okay. You should shut up now, and I should have it. And if you, how can I say it? If you resist, then I should kick you. These kind of stuff.
Desperation is a powerful force.
Yeah, and I guess the thing is, the reduction maybe not go to the levels of zeros, but the reduction of violence would be much more aligned with the self-enlightenment, maybe.
I really recommend that you take a look at Steven Pinker's argument, because I think he's talking a lot about all the different things. I mean, he goes into all these different details. I mean, if you stop and think about it, it was super ordinary in Europe during the Middle Ages to take prisoners, break them on the wheel, put them in stocks, pull people apart. Remember drawing and quartering? Remember hanging people from the gallows in the village square? People thought of that kind of violence as super ordinary. Bear baiting, do you remember dog fighting? Cockfighting still exists in parts of the world. We have had times in human history when violence, that kind of casual violence, was super normal. And part of his argument is that, yes, exactly what you're saying. I mean, power is an issue, and people, when they're desperate, do stuff. But they also do it more when they think it's normal. They also have the habit of doing what people around them are doing. And our perception of violence and our perception of it as a rational choice or a feasible choice also matters. So the psychology of violence is actually kind of complicated and not always what meets our eye. So I really think Steven Pinker has some very interesting things to say about it. A lot of people have talked about violence over a long time, but there's a lot of stuff there that you might find interesting. I recommend it.
I think we had a question in the back. Yes.
You talked about now there are some Syrian refugees in Turkey, in the southeast, and as far as we know, or let's say we hear from the gossip, that there are some Turkish gentlemen, Turkish young men, want to get married with some Syrian woman from the camp and start their life in Turkey. And is this a type of gender-based violence, and as well, like you said, survival sex?
In my opinion, a woman who marries a man because, okay, here, I'll tell you a little story. I spoke a couple of weeks ago with a woman who, in a camp, she had broken up from her husband. I actually can't sort out from her story whether he had died or whether they had divorced before she left Syria. It probably doesn't matter. But the point is that she came with 2 small children to Turkey alone. She also happens to not have any male relatives here in Turkey. So she ended up in a camp after a few other kinds of places where she stayed. And she quickly discovered that because she actually has rather pale complexion, she's a nice looking woman, she's well spoken, she was suddenly very in demand, in the sense that there were a lot of people who said, you should get married. And in fact, if you don't get married, you are in danger. And she described men jumping into her tent to say, if you scream, I'll say that it's you who invited me in anyway, so what are you going to do about it? And this kind of thing, because as a single woman without protection, she's fair game. And she said to us, I'm really seriously thinking about taking up the offer that I heard through a friend of a friend, that this man in Istanbul said that he'd be willing to marry me if I would, and that looks like a way out of this terrible situation. Shall I do it? What do you think? Is that gender-based violence? I don't know what we want to call these things, you know? I just don't know what we want to call these things. But my heart bleeds for her if she feels that's her only choice. It happens, the good news in that story is that she got her tent relocated closer to some people who were a protective family towards her, and for the last couple of weeks I haven't heard any more about this person from Istanbul. So at least for this moment, I'm happy about that situation. But you know, she cannot be an unusual case.
We had a few questions. Yes?
Yeah, so as someone working with refugees outside the camps, are there any sort of examples of program design that you've seen elsewhere in the world that have helped to reduce this? I mean, outside of the camps, our main interventions are in providing services. And
right.
Clearly, I was wondering if you'd seen any examples of ways of structuring incentives and providing services in a way that helped to break down gender-based violence.
Absolutely. You can develop small solidarity support type groups. There's research that's been done in Africa about for sexual abuse survivors, particularly in post-conflict kind of a situation, or actually mid-conflict kind of a situation, where they're getting some reduction in their trauma symptoms. We also see the research that I did here in Ankara with women who were sexual abuse survivors showed that there was an enormous amount of solidarity that the women tended to build with each other, which was very potent for many of them in their lives. There are services in the Turkish realm that can be useful to people if the language issues can be worked out. So there is a social service structure in Turkey that has some pieces of this, and then there are programs and pieces that I could give you more information at another point, but I'm not going to say this is a highly developed art and here's the recipe and you just go do this and it'll all fix. But I am going to say there is some stuff that's promising out there.
Right, we probably have time for a few more questions, so yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering what kind of reactions do you get in the camps from the women, or especially from men, for example? Do you have negative reactions to your work?
Sure. Can you imagine that as a woman doing gender-based violence work, I wouldn't have already been very used to negative reactions? No. You walk in and you expect people to be suspicious of you. You walk in and you know that if you're going to do this kind of work, the very, very, very first thing you've got to do is build trust and build relationship. So, of course, our first thing is to spend a lot of time, and that's one of the reasons we've chosen to start off with training staff in camps and training people who are working with Syrians. So we work with the Syrians, but we actually have front-loaded the project much heavier on working with the staff of the camp. That's the security people, the cleaning people, the healthcare providers, the administrators, everybody who works in the camp. And we give them training, both so that they can understand what trauma is, and then also so that they can look at how actually they're in the same boat with these folks. Maybe their situation isn't so extreme, but these are human experiences. And actually, we're all in this same stuff. It's all a matter of degree. So I try as much as possible to stay human and authentic and connect with people at that level. And it doesn't always work, but sometimes it's more effective than something else.
There was a question there.
Thank you very much for this vibrant talk. And although I think the activist part of the talk and the activist part of you is the most vibrant story, I'll go back a bit to the theoretical idea and the books that you referenced. I think there is a tricky story there about the reduction of violence through time. And the tricky thing is exactly, you mentioned it, the moment that the general level of violence reduces and stops becoming the everyday reality, the problem then is the return back to violence psychologically is much bigger trauma than if violence is a kind of everyday life thing. So I think there is a problem, because we really need to think, what are we actually measuring when we are saying that, throughout time violence has been decreasing? Because I think it's much devastating as a kind of breaking the social bonds in the psychology of communities.
Right.
The turn from non-violence to extreme violence, because the problem is that throughout time, the same degree of violence appears and reappears.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a significant problem with the argument quantifying violence instead of looking at the qualities of violence, which unfortunately has not changed.
Well, okay, and like I said, for me to represent to you Pinker's whole argument is impossible. And I would agree with you that he is primarily focused on this quantitative side, because that's what he can do, actually. Looking that far back in history, it's a statistical argument, actually, is a large piece of what he's doing when we talk about the history of war, etc. So we're talking about numbers of murders, we're talking about casualties in war. So it is a very statistical argument, and I agree with you completely, that may very well miss a big piece of the qualitative point. However, as a therapist who works with trauma, one of the things that I'd have to say is also true is we have more insight now into what the mechanisms are. Remember, trauma is an event. The effects of trauma are a separate, qualitative, perception-based, experiential reality. Okay? So you're pointing to how important that is, in that the contrast between non-traumatic and traumatic is a relative question, right? I'm fond of saying, I've also got a book that I've written, it's for survivors of sexual abuse, and it's called True Friend. And there's a section in here that's called Everything is Interpretation, Interpretation is Everything. And I think we have to acknowledge that. To some extent, that's really a huge piece of what's going on when we deal with trauma. However, I think the other piece we have is more handle on how to work with interpretation and what the physiological basis is of perception. And I think we're making some headway. Maybe I'm just an optimist, in understanding some things we can do that can help to adjust people's experiences and perceptions. Particularly here, I'm speaking, and now we're getting into some kind of technical stuff that we might not want to go too far into, but issues of narrative and understanding the power of narrative have made some real progress in recent times. So understanding the meaning of traumatic experience, the meaning of violence, and the narratives that we put around that, I think are some things we've had some genuine psychological progress around in recent times, and we could talk about that another time. Another cause for my hope.
Right, I think we have time for one last question. So, yes, over there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Few decades ago, because of the conflict in Bulgaria, some people immigrated into Turkey. And again, because of the conflict in Iraq, lots of refugees was in Turkey.
Yeah.
Is there an academic study on those both cases? I'm asking this question because I would like to learn what will be the next in Syrian case.
Well, I'll bet there are, and I'm not familiar with them. I can't give you the references on that. So someone who's more informed than I, is there someone here who knows about the academic studies of the other refugee experiences here in Turkey? I know there are because I've heard of things, but I'm sorry, I can't point you in that direction. But again, I'd like to go back to what you're saying, which is that I've seen some stuff, and I especially value a lot of the qualitative work that I've seen around these issues, because I think perception is so important. And so when you find it, would you let me know? And especially if you find some good qualitative stuff, I'd love to see it.
So
Thank you.
I'd just like to add on the comment about Iraqi refugees in Bulgaria. I know that actually if you are from Iraq or Syria, you are not a refugee in Turkey, as Turkey only recognizes a refugee from Europe. If you are from Iraq or Syria, you are not a refugee. So Bulgarians could be refugees, so their experience would be very different when compared to Iraqis in Syria. So actually, they're not even refugees, so you can't even use that word, which is quite strange.
There's a bunch of politics around the naming of groups as refugees or guests or people who are temporarily here. And I won't get into those details, but I bet you're right. I bet that also qualitatively affects the experience of these folks. Anything else? Great. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate your kind attention.
I'd like to thank Leyla for making time available to give this fascinating and valuable and necessary talk on these issues. Ever since we started talking about doing this, I've been very excited about, tonight's lecture, and I can see that I was, excited for all the right reasons. I'd also like to say thank you to the Turkish-American Association for giving us their support and allowing us to hold this lecture here at their venue. And I'd like to thank everybody here for coming along and listening to Leyla on this very important and interesting topic tonight that affects us in our daily lives. Thank you.
Come through the rain and the cold, so get me soon.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just gonna, I mean, it's on this, so I can just stay on this, right?
Can it leave?
Yeah. He wants it for some purpose, so just give it back to him.